Okay, cool. Let's get started. Hey everyone, good morning. My name is Pratul. I am one of the co-founders of Tramline. Thank you for coming to a session right before lunch. This is, I'm hungry. Everyone's hungry. I'm going to wrap it up quickly. So cool. I'm going to talk about a method to measure the effectiveness of your app release process, and we call it Reldex. Engineering teams have been measuring important metrics for decades. We use metrics to know what to improve, and we use those metrics to ensure that improvements have actually happened. For example, application performance, metrics like cold start time and API throughput and memory pressure, we use these. Another example is product metrics. We measure stuff like daily active users or session lengths or the rate of a feature adoption. And we measure DevOps metrics. So lead time, deployment frequency, change failure rate, and mean time to restore. Also popularly called as the DORA metrics. You might have heard this. This is a thing that Google did. Now, unfortunately, DORA metrics do not work very well for app releases. And that's because the App Store model does not let us do continuous delivery or rollbacks. Deployment frequency, even for large-scale apps, is very low in comparison to, say, backend APIs or web apps. And I'm not even sure what mean time to restore would mean for an app, given that apps are client-side. So we've come up with something new, and we call it Reldex, which is short for Release Process Index. Maybe you're thinking of AppDex, and if you are thinking of AppDex, you are not entirely wrong. Reldex does use the same grading maths as AppDex does. AppDex is an open standard as well. And we also really like the compactness of the AppDex name, but that's about it. There is no other similarity between what AppDex does and what we propose with Reldex. That's where the similarity ends. AppDex is a way to grade the end user experience by converting measurements from multiple metrics into a single score. Reldex is a way to grade release process performance by converting those measurements from multiple metrics into a single score. So the key difference being, of course, end user experience versus the release process performance. Which means that it is possible even if your Reldex score is great, like maybe your release process is great, your AppDex score could still be bad. Your end user could still receive bad things, right? So how does Reldex work, and right, what does it do? We have 5 individual components. First, we define certain key metrics that make up Reldex. Second, we define the acceptable range for each of those metrics. Third, we assign weights to each metric because not all metrics are equally important. Fourth, by using those range and weight values, we get a score for each metric. And fifth, we arrive at the Reldex value and grade, right? The 6 metrics that make up Reldex are these metrics: overall time to release, time to stabilize, time to complete stage rollout, number of hotfixes during stage rollout, number of days since last release, and number of days between the last release and latest hotfix. Again, you'll notice that these are really app-specific because Reldex really pertains to the app delivery process. So, for instance, overall time to release is if you started your release process or your release cycle on a Wednesday, how long did it take you, how many days did it take you to get to 100% rollout? Time to stabilize RC is how long did it take you from the start of your release to the start of your production rollout. So maybe it takes you 5 days to stabilize an RC, right? Time to complete stage rollout, pretty obvious. Number of hotfixes during stage rollout, right? So you're going from 0% to 100% and you're realizing, hey, something's broken. I can see customer devices if something's broken. Those are those hotfixes. Number of days since last release, pretty obvious. And the number of days between your last release and the latest hotfix. So just to clarify, say your last release finished on the 1st of the month, and you had to do a hotfix on the 4th because you realized 4 days later that there was a game-breaking bug. That's 4 days. This sort of kind of is like DORA, but not exactly, but I'm going to draw some parallels, right? So overall time to release is kind of like the lead time for mobile apps. The number of days since last release is kind of like your deployment frequency. Your number of hotfixes during stage rollout, sort of like change failure rate, and the number of days between the last release and the latest hotfix is sort of like the mean time to restore in case your app has a game-breaking bug, right? So I've covered metrics. We have a bunch of other stuff. Let's look at the rest of it. Scoring. That's the meat of Reldex. Every metric has 2 parts. There is an acceptable range and there is a weight. So for example, overall time to release, the default acceptable range that we have is 10 to 12 days to go from start of release to 100% rollout. And the weight that this has is 20%. That weight means that this metric contributes 20% to the final Reldex score. An important point to note, and I will repeat this a couple of times, is that the numbers for every metric that I mentioned are just the defaults. These are not absolute. You can change them. You should change them because apps are quite different from each other depending on the scale, depending on the industry you're in. So these numbers are not set in stone. Scoring is, again, using the acceptable range, we arrive at the score, which is that if the metric is better than the range, so you did better than your default range, the score is 1. If it's within the range, the score is 0.5. If the metric is worse than the range, your score is 0. Right? Pretty straightforward. And a very simple final formula to arrive at the Reldex, which is we multiply the scores and the weights for all the metrics, we add them all up. As simple as that. Reldex is both a score and one of 3 grades. So the 3 grades are excellent, acceptable, and mediocre. Our default values are these that I mentioned on the slide, greater than 7.5, between 0.5 and 0.75, and less than 0.5. Again, these are just default values. You could change these to suit your team, and you perhaps should. In our experience, teams do change this sometimes to suit what they want. Here is a full list of range and weight for each metric, but Reldex is, of course, relative. It is not absolute. Your numbers are not another team's numbers because the numbers that work for a large team, probably do not work for a small team, right? So they can look different. It's important to note that Reldex is relative to your team and your process because you set the range and the weights. It is not a North Star metric that all teams must equally shoot for. It is not even absolute in terms of the metrics themselves, because it's possible, depending on the kind of app that you work on, that perhaps one of the 6 metrics don't actually apply to you. They're not relevant to your team, so you should just skip that metric. Think of it like a check engine light for your app release process, right? It is great for figuring out what is wrong, but it may not be the best to figure out why that thing is wrong. But it is also very useful over time to see your Reldex value change and know if you're working in the right direction. Because as teams and organizations evolve, processes can erode over time. And without an indicator like Reldex, there is no clear way of knowing if things over time are changing for the better or for the worse, right? So this number ensures that you have something to look at to measure your release process over time. Of course, if you're using Tramline, which is the product that I work on, this Reldex is measured and tracked automatically for you, but because Tramline is open source, so is Reldex. If you scan that QR code, it links to a Google Sheet that you can duplicate and calculate Reldex by hand for your own releases. Use it in any way you want. It's, as I said, Apache licensed. Perhaps you have an internal release system inside your company. We want you to take the idea. You want you to build Reldex into your own systems. Of course, please come to us and talk to us about it. What do you think? We want to know. We're also sponsors, and our booth is right outside those doors, so I will be right there. Thank you.